Hi guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most disorienting scenarios imaginable. What if time suddenly started running backward? Not just rewinding like a movie, but actually reversing the fundamental arrow of causality itself. Confetti rising off the ground, champagne flowing back into bottles, and everything you know about cause and effect completely inverted. If you enjoy these mind-bending sleep stories that flip reality on its head, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. I always love connecting with fellow night thinkers worldwide. Alright, let's begin. In the grand theatre of existence, imagine for a moment that the fundamental arrow of time itself began to reverse. Not the gentle rewinding of a clock or the nostalgic flip through old photographs, but the complete inversion of causality itself. Picture yourself standing in Times Square at precisely 11:59 on New Year's Eve, watching confetti rise from the pavement back into the air, assembling itself into perfect streamers as champagne flows upward from glasses back into bottles, and the countdown begins to ascend from 0 back to midnight of the previous year. This is not merely the stuff of science fiction or philosophical thought experiments. The reversal of time's arrow would represent the most catastrophic and bewildering transformation our universe could undergo, touching every atom, every heartbeat, every photon of light streaming from distant stars. To understand what this would mean, we must first grasp the profound nature of time itself and why its direction seems so fundamentally embedded in the very fabric of reality. Time, as we experience it, flows in one direction because of what physicists call the second law of thermodynamics. This law states that entropy, a measure of disorder or randomness in a system, always increases in isolated systems. When you drop a glass vase on a marble floor, it shatters into dozens of pieces because there are exponentially more ways for the molecules to be arranged in a broken state than in the perfect crystalline structure of the intact vase. The probability of those scattered fragments spontaneously reassembling themselves into the original vase is so astronomically small, roughly 1 chance in 10 to the power of 23, that it would never happen even if we waited longer than the current age of the universe, which stands at approximately 13.8 billion years. But in a world where time runs backward, this fundamental principle would reverse. Entropy would decrease rather than increase. The scattered fragments of that vase would indeed begin to slide across the floor, lifting themselves up and clicking together with perfect precision until the original beautiful vessel reformed in your hands. The sound waves from the crash would converge back toward the point of impact, travelling backward through the air until they compressed back into the moment of silence before the accident occurred. Consider what this would mean for the roughly 7.9 billion people currently inhabiting Earth. Each human body contains approximately 37 trillion cells, and these cells are constantly dying and being replaced at a rate of about 300 billion per day. In our normal timeline, this represents growth, healing, and the gradual aging process. But with reverse time, this cellular regeneration would work in reverse. Wounds would close before they were inflicted. Scars would gradually fade and disappear. The elderly would grow younger day by day, their wrinkles smoothing out, their hair returning to its original colour and thickness, their memories becoming sharper and more vivid as decades of accumulated damage to neural pathways reversed itself. The implications become even more staggering when we consider the energy systems that power our civilization. Every second, humans consume approximately 560 terawatt-hours of energy globally. In our normal timeline, this energy flows from organized forms like fossil fuels, nuclear reactions, or flowing water, and dissipates into heat and waste. The gasoline in your car's tank, containing roughly 34 million joules of energy per litre, burns in the engine cylinders, creating the controlled explosions that move pistons and turn wheels, but ultimately converting that organized chemical energy into heat, motion, and exhaust gases that disperse into the atmosphere. With reverse time, this entire process would run backward. Exhaust gases would flow back into tailpipes, reassembling into gasoline molecules. Heat would flow from the cooler atmosphere back into the warmer engine block, violating our understanding of thermal dynamics. The electricity flowing through power lines would reverse direction, but more fundamentally, the very concept of generation and consumption would flip. Power plants would absorb electricity from the grid and use it to extract coal from ash, to split water back into hydrogen and oxygen, to contain nuclear reactions rather than harness them. The electromagnetic spectrum itself would reverse its behavior. Radio waves currently travel outward from transmission towers at the speed of light, approximately 299,792,458 meters per second. In a time-reversed world, these waves would converge back toward their sources, the radio signals that left Earth decades ago and are now travelling through interstellar space would begin their journey homeward. The television broadcasts of the Apollo 11 moon landing, currently about 54 light-years away from Earth, would start their return journey, ultimately converging back at the transmission antennas in Houston and being absorbed rather than broadcast. This reversal would create extraordinary phenomena in our atmosphere and oceans. Every day, approximately 510 trillion kilograms of water evaporate from Earth's surface. This water rises, condenses into clouds, and eventually falls as precipitation in a continuous cycle driven by solar energy. With time reversed, this cycle would run backward, but in ways that would appear miraculous to our forward time-oriented minds. Rain would fall upward from the ground back into clouds. Rivers would flow backward toward their sources. The massive Amazon River, which normally carries about 219,000 cubic meters of water per second into the Atlantic Ocean, would instead draw water from the ocean and push it upstream, climbing elevation against what we understand as gravity's pull. The reversal of biological processes would perhaps be the most visible and disturbing aspect of this temporal inversion. The food chains that connect all life on Earth involve approximately 1 quadrillion individual organisms across millions of species. In normal time, plants convert sunlight into chemical energy through photosynthesis, producing about 170 billion tons of biomass annually. Animals eat plants, predators eat prey, and decomposers break down dead organic matter, recycling nutrients back into the ecosystem. With reverse time, decomposition would reverse into composition. Dead organisms would spontaneously reassemble from the soil, their constituent atoms gathering together to rebuild complex tissues and structures. A fallen tree in the forest would lift itself up, its trunk healing and strengthening, its roots drawing nutrients from the soil not for growth, but to concentrate them for the mysterious reverse process that would eventually transform organic matter back into inorganic components. Photosynthesis would run in reverse, with plants absorbing oxygen from the atmosphere and releasing carbon dioxide while somehow extracting energy from their own chemical bonds to emit light back toward the sun. This reverse photosynthesis would mean that Earth's atmosphere, which currently contains about 21% oxygen produced by billions of years of plant activity, would gradually see its oxygen concentration decrease as plants absorbed it back. The carbon cycle, which involves the movement of approximately 750 billion tons of carbon through various reservoirs including the atmosphere, oceans, land surface and deep Earth, would completely reverse its direction. The carbon dioxide currently being added to the atmosphere at a rate of about 37 billion tons per year through human activities would instead be extracted from the atmosphere and concentrated back into fossil fuel deposits deep underground. ocean currents driven by temperature differences and the rotation of the Earth would reverse their flows. The Gulf Stream, which transports about 30 million cubic meters of warm water per second from the Gulf of Mexico toward northern Europe, would instead carry cold water southward, fundamentally altering weather patterns across the Atlantic basin. The thermohaline circulation, often called the ocean's conveyor belt, moves approximately 20 million cubic meters of water per second in a global pattern that takes roughly 1,000 years to complete one full cycle. This too would reverse, causing profound climate changes as warm and cold water masses exchange positions in ways that would seem to violate basic physics. The reversal of time would also profoundly affect the behavior of light itself. Currently, stars emit electromagnetic radiation in all directions, and this light travels outward through space, eventually reaching planets, moons, and other celestial bodies millions or billions of years later. With reversed time, this process would invert. Stars would absorb light rather than emit it, pulling in photons from across the universe. The night sky would gradually darken as stars consumed the light they had previously emitted. Our own sun, which converts approximately 4 million tons of mass into energy every second through nuclear fusion, would reverse this process. Instead of fusing hydrogen into helium and releasing tremendous amounts of energy, it would absorb energy and split helium back into hydrogen. The solar wind, consisting of charged particles travelling outward from the sun at speeds of about 400 kilometers per second, would reverse direction and flow back toward the sun. This reversal would have immediate consequences for Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere. Our planet's magnetosphere, which deflects most of the solar wind and protects us from harmful radiation, would instead channel this reverse solar wind toward Earth's surface. The aurora borealis and aurora australis, those beautiful light displays caused by charged particles interacting with our atmosphere, would appear to flow backward, with light moving from the atmosphere up towards space rather than the reverse. The implications for human technology would be staggering. Every electronic device depends on the controlled flow of electrons through circuits. With time reversed, electrical current would flow backward through every wire, every circuit board, every microprocessor. The approximately 26 billion connected devices that make up the Internet of Things would begin receiving signals before they sent them, processing outputs before inputs, storing data that had not yet been created. Computer processors, which currently execute billions of operations per second by manipulating electrical signals according to precise logical rules, would run these operations in reverse. A typical smartphone processor, running at speeds of several gigahertz, would begin unconsuming battery power, generating electricity instead of using it, and somehow producing the raw materials that went into its manufacture. The global internet, which handles approximately 4.8 billion internet users, generating exabytes of data daily, would experience a complete reversal of information flow. Data would travel from destinations back to sources, emails would be unwritten and unthought, search queries would provide answers before questions were asked. The massive data centers that consume about 200 terawatt-hours of electricity annually would instead generate electricity while consuming data, somehow converting information back into the energy required to maintain the servers that process it. Transportation systems would exhibit equally bizarre behavior. The approximately 1.4 billion motor vehicles currently in use worldwide would drive backward, not just in terms of physical direction, but in terms of causality itself. Passengers would arrive at their destinations before departing from their origins. Fuel would flow from exhaust pipes back into gas tanks. The wear and tear on engines, tyres, and mechanical components would reverse, with older vehicles becoming newer and more efficient over time. Aircraft present an even more complex scenario. The approximately 26,000 commercial flights operating daily worldwide rely on the principles of aerodynamics, where air flowing over wing surfaces creates pressure differences that generate lift. With reverse time, planes would somehow generate the air currents that lift them, creating their own headwinds and tailwinds in patterns that would seem to violate conservation of energy and momentum. The financial implications of temporal reversal would be mind-bending. The global economy, representing approximately $96 trillion in gross domestic product, depends on the concept of transactions occurring in sequence over time. Money flows from buyers to sellers, investments grow or shrink based on market performance, and economic value is created through labor and innovation. With reverse time, these transactions would unwind. Purchases would become returns, loans would transform into deposits, and economic growth would become economic contraction as value flowed backward through the system. The approximately $56 trillion in total global debt would gradually transform back into the assets and labor that originally created the wealth to justify those obligations. Stock markets, which process trillions of dollars in trades daily, would see prices moving in response to future events rather than past performance. The roughly $2 trillion traded daily in foreign exchange markets would flow backward, with currencies unconverting themselves into the economic activities that originally gave them value. Weather systems would exhibit perhaps the most visually dramatic reversals. Hurricanes, which can contain energy equivalent to about 600 trillion watts at their peak intensity, would spin backward while somehow absorbing energy from their surroundings instead of dissipating it. These storms would gather strength as they moved away from warm ocean waters toward cooler regions, defying every principle of thermodynamics we understand. Tornadoes would appear to create the conditions that spawn them, generating the temperature and pressure differentials needed for their formation, rather than arising from those conditions. Lightning would flow upward from the ground toward clouds, carrying positive electrical charge instead of neutralizing it, and somehow creating the electrical potential differences that we normally think of as causing the discharge. Precipitation would fall upward, with water droplets and ice crystals climbing from the Earth's surface back toward the clouds that formed them. The water cycle, which moves approximately 577,000 cubic kilometers of water annually between the oceans, atmosphere, and land, would reverse its direction while maintaining its volume, creating the paradoxical situation where evaporation would precede condensation and rain would cause the clouds that produce it. The geological processes that shape our planet would also reverse their direction. Earthquakes would heal fault lines rather than create them, pushing separated rock masses back together with the same force that originally split them apart. Volcanic eruptions would draw lava back into the Earth's interior, somehow cooling it in the process and concentrating the gases that were originally dissolved in the molten rock. Mountain formation would reverse, with peaks gradually sinking back towards sea level as the tectonic forces that raised them began pulling in the opposite direction. The Himalayas, which continue rising at a rate of about 4 millimeters per year due to the collision between the Indian and Eurasian plates, would instead begin shrinking at the same rate, eventually returning to the sea level elevations they held before the Great Collision began 50 million years ago. Erosion would reverse into construction, with rivers and streams depositing sediment upstream rather than carrying it downstream. The Grand Canyon, carved over millions of years by the Colorado River, removing approximately 1,000 cubic kilometers of rock, would gradually fill back in as the river deposited material rather than eroding it. Wind would pick up sand and soil from distant locations and concentrate it back at its origin points, rebuilding the landscapes that were slowly worn away over geological time. The implications for human consciousness and memory would be the most philosophically challenging aspect of temporal reversal. Human brains contain approximately 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through synapses that store and process information. Memory formation involves the strengthening of specific neural pathways through repeated activation and the production of proteins that help maintain these connections over time. With reverse time, memory formation would become memory dissolution. Instead of learning new information and skills, people would gradually forget what they knew. The neural pathways that encode memories would weaken rather than strengthen with repetition. Knowledge would flow backward from conscious awareness into the unconscious neural processes that originally created it. Yet this raises profound paradoxes about consciousness itself. If memories were forming in reverse, would people be aware of forgetting, or would the very awareness of the forgetting process also reverse? Would consciousness flow backward through time, experiencing events in reverse order, or would some aspect of awareness remain oriented toward what we currently think of as the future? The educational systems that currently serve approximately 1.6 billion students worldwide would face an impossible situation. Instead of transferring knowledge from teachers to students, information would flow backward, with students somehow providing knowledge to their instructors. Universities and schools would become centers of concentrated ignorance rather than learning, places where the accumulated wisdom of civilization would be gathered and then dispersed back into the unknowing minds that originally created it. Language itself would be affected in ways that challenge our understanding of communication. The approximately 7,000 languages currently spoken by humanity evolved over tens of thousands of years through gradual changes in pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. With reverse time, languages would devolve, becoming simpler and more primitive until they eventually dissolved back into the pre-linguistic vocalizations from which they originated. Written communication would present even more dramatic reversals. The billions of books, documents, and digital records that contain human knowledge would gradually lose their information content. Text would fade from pages, not through physical decay, but through the reverse of whatever process originally created meaning from symbols. Libraries would become places where information was destroyed rather than preserved, with librarians somehow extracting knowledge from books and returning it to the minds that originally conceived it. The reversal of biological evolution would transform the entire tree of life on Earth. The approximately 8.7 million species currently estimated to exist represent the results of about 3.8 billion years of evolutionary development. With time reversed, this process would run backward, with complex organisms gradually becoming simpler and more primitive. Humans would devolve through their evolutionary history, gradually losing the traits that distinguish them from their ancestors. The complex cognitive abilities that emerged over millions of years of brain evolution would disappear in reverse order. Language, tool use, symbolic thinking, and eventually even bipedalism would fade as human populations transformed back through the various hominid species that preceded modern Homo sapiens. This devolution would affect all life on Earth simultaneously. The approximately 1 trillion species that have ever existed, most of which are now extinct, would somehow reappear as their evolutionary descendants transformed back into their ancestral forms. The fossil record, which documents the history of life through preserved remains in sedimentary rocks, would become a prediction of the future rather than a record of the past. Ecosystems would restructure themselves in ways that seem impossible, according to our understanding of ecology. Predator-prey relationships would reverse, with prey species somehow generating their predators rather than being consumed by them. The approximately 43,000 species currently listed as threatened or endangered would recover their populations by drawing individuals back from the future states where their numbers had dwindled. The carbon-oxygen cycle that maintains atmospheric conditions suitable for life would reverse its flow. Instead of plants producing oxygen and consuming carbon dioxide while animals do the reverse, these processes would flip. The atmospheric composition that took billions of years to reach its current state, with nitrogen at about 78%, oxygen at 21%, and various trace gases making up the remainder, would gradually change as these cycles unwound. Climate systems would exhibit behavior that challenges our understanding of energy flow and thermodynamics. The greenhouse effect, which currently maintains Earth's average temperature at about 15 degrees Celsius rather than the minus 18 degrees it would be without an atmosphere, would somehow reverse. Heat would flow from cooler regions toward warmer areas, concentrating energy rather than distributing it. The polar ice caps, which currently contain about 24 million cubic kilometers of ice, representing roughly 68% of the world's fresh water, would grow rather than shrink as global temperatures somehow decreased while heat flowed backward through the system. Glaciers would advance rather than retreat, growing larger and thicker as they absorbed rather than melted from the thermal energy in their environment. Ocean circulation patterns would reverse on multiple scales. Surface currents driven by wind patterns would flow backward, but the winds themselves would be generated by pressure differences that resulted from the movement of air masses rather than causing it. The deep ocean currents driven by temperature and salinity differences would also reverse, carrying cold water toward the tropics and warm water toward the poles, in defiance of basic thermodynamic principles. Technological systems would face impossible challenges as their fundamental operating principles reversed. Power generation facilities would consume electricity rather than produce it, somehow converting electrical energy back into the fossil fuels, uranium, or renewable resources that originally created it. The global electrical grid, which delivers approximately 28,000 terawatt-hours of electricity annually, would flow backward, drawing energy from end users and concentrating it at generation facilities. Manufacturing processes would run in reverse, with finished products spontaneously disassembling themselves back into raw materials. Automobile factories would consume cars and produce steel, aluminum, rubber, and plastic. Electronics manufacturing facilities would absorb smartphones, computers, and other devices, somehow extracting the rare earth elements, silicon, and other materials that went into their construction. The mining and extraction industries would transform from extractive to constructive operations. Instead of removing coal, oil, metals, and other materials from the earth, mining operations would concentrate these resources back into underground deposits. Oil wells would pump petroleum products back into underground reservoirs, where they would somehow transform back into the ancient organic matter that originally created them over millions of years. Agriculture would become a process of unconsuming food rather than producing it. Crops would absorb nutrients from human and animal digestive systems, growing backward from harvested produce into seeds, and eventually into the soil conditions that supported their growth. Livestock would transform from sources of meat, milk, and other animal products into concentrators of plant material, somehow reversing the biological processes that convert grass and grain into animal protein. The transportation of goods would flow backward through global supply chains. The approximately 11 billion tons of cargo that move through international trade annually would travel from consumers back to producers, with finished goods transforming back into raw materials during their journey. Container ships, which currently carry about 60% of global trade by value, would load cargo at destination ports and deliver raw materials to origin points. Communication systems would experience temporal paradoxes as information flowed backward through networks. The approximately 4 billion internet users worldwide would receive messages before they were sent, browse websites before they were created, and somehow generate the digital content that they appeared to be consuming. Social media platforms would see posts and comments flowing backward through time, with responses preceding the original messages that prompted them. The global positioning system, which relies on precise timing signals from satellites approximately 20,000 kilometers above Earth's surface, would face fundamental challenges as those timing signals reverse their direction. Navigation would require predicting past locations rather than determining current positions, and the system would somehow need to generate the precise atomic clock measurements that make GPS possible. Medical systems would witness the reversal of disease and healing processes in ways that challenge everything we understand about biology and medicine. Hospitals would see patients becoming sicker rather than healthier, with treatments causing the conditions they were designed to cure. Medications would flow backward through metabolic pathways, somehow concentrating back into their original molecular forms rather than being broken down and eliminated by the body. Surgical procedures would reverse themselves, with healed tissues reopening and surgical materials extracting themselves from patients' bodies. Medical imaging would show organs and systems becoming less healthy over time, with doctors somehow using this information to predict the past conditions that would eventually require treatment. The pharmaceutical industry would transform from developing treatments to unconcentrating them, with research facilities somehow extracting the knowledge and materials that went into drug development and returning them to their original states. Clinical trials would run backward, with patients losing the benefits of experimental treatments and returning to their baseline conditions. Emergency services would respond to disasters before they occurred, arriving at accident scenes in time to prevent injuries by removing the safety measures that would have protected victims. Fire departments would start fires rather than extinguish them. Police would create crimes rather than solve them, and ambulances would deliver patients to the locations where they would eventually be injured. The reversal of photosynthesis would have cascading effects throughout the biosphere that go far beyond simple plant metabolism. The approximately 170 billion tons of biomass produced annually by photosynthesis represent the foundation of virtually all food chains on Earth. With this process reversed, the energy flow that supports life would begin moving backward through trophic levels. Primary producers would become primary consumers, absorbing energy from the organisms that typically feed on them. Herbivores would somehow provide energy to plants rather than deriving nutrition from them. Carnivores would energize their prey rather than consuming them for sustenance. The entire concept of predation would reverse, with predators becoming sources of energy for their former prey species. Decomposition, the process that recycles nutrients and organic matter back into ecosystems, would reverse into composition. Dead organisms would reassemble from their constituent elements, rising from soils and sediments, where they had been broken down by bacteria, fungi, and other decomposers. These decomposer organisms would transform from recyclers into concentrators, somehow gathering organic matter and building it into complex structures rather than breaking it down. The global carbon cycle would experience dramatic reversals at every level. The approximately 750 billion tons of carbon that cycles through various reservoirs would begin flowing backward through biological, geological, and atmospheric systems. Fossil fuel deposits would grow rather than shrink as carbon dioxide was extracted from the atmosphere and concentrated back into underground reserves. Coral reefs, which currently support about 25% of all marine species, despite covering less than 1% of ocean area, would exhibit particularly dramatic changes. The calcium carbonate structures that form reef systems would dissolve back into the seawater from which they originally precipitated, but the organisms that created them would somehow become healthier and more abundant in the process. Marine food chains would reverse their energy flow, with microscopic phytoplankton absorbing energy from the krill, fish, and marine mammals that typically feed on them. The approximately 50 billion tons of marine biomass would reorganize itself into reverse trophic pyramids, with larger organisms supporting smaller ones rather than the reverse. Weather prediction would become weather creation, with meteorological systems somehow generating the atmospheric conditions that produced them. The approximately 10 to the 15th power joules of energy contained in a typical hurricane would flow backward into the ocean temperatures, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure systems that originally created the storm. Seasonal patterns would reverse their relationship to solar radiation and planetary position. Spring would become a time when plants absorb their growth back into seeds. Summer would see the concentration of solar energy back toward the sun. Autumn would witness leaves and fruits growing back onto trees, and winter would become a season of warming rather than cooling. The hydrological cycle would reverse at every scale, from individual raindrops to continental weather patterns. The approximately 510 trillion kilograms of water that evaporate annually from Earth's surface would somehow condense first and then evaporate backward, creating precipitation that fell upward from surface water into atmospheric moisture that had not yet condensed. Rivers would flow backward not just in terms of direction, but in terms of the gravitational and thermal processes that drive water movement. The potential energy that moves water from high elevations towards sea level would reverse, somehow concentrating energy at higher elevations while drawing water upward against gravitational forces. The reversal of time would create paradoxes in human society that challenge our most basic assumptions about causality and purpose. Legal systems would need to prosecute crimes before they were committed, with judges and juries somehow determining guilt for actions that had not yet occurred. Contracts would be fulfilled before they were signed, with parties receiving benefits before agreeing to terms. Educational institutions would graduate students who had not yet enrolled, awarding degrees for knowledge that recipients had not yet acquired. Research universities would publish findings before conducting experiments, somehow generating conclusions that would later be supported by evidence that had not yet been collected. Financial markets would experience trades based on future performance rather than past results, with investors buying stocks that would later decrease in value and selling securities before they increased in price. The approximately $100 trillion in global financial assets would flow backward through investment chains, with returns preceding investments and profits generating the business activities that created them. Insurance companies would pay claims before losses occurred, somehow compensating policyholders for damages that had not yet happened, while collecting premiums that would later be justified by claims payouts. Risk assessment would require predicting past events rather than future probabilities, fundamentally reversing the mathematical and statistical foundations of actuarial science. Construction projects would see buildings disassembling themselves back into raw materials, with workers somehow coordinating the reverse flow of labour and resources needed to unconcentrate completed structures. The approximately $3 trillion in annual global construction spending would flow backward from finished projects to the labour, materials and land that originally made construction possible. Transportation infrastructure would witness traffic flowing backward through road networks, with vehicles arriving at origins before departing from destinations. The approximately $1 trillion invested annually in global transportation systems would unconcentrate itself back into the economic activities that originally justified these investments. Communication networks would carry information backward through time, with messages arriving before they were sent and conversations ending before they began. The approximately 4.6 billion mobile phone subscriptions worldwide would facilitate backward communication, somehow connecting callers to conversations that had not yet been initiated. As we contemplate this impossible scenario of time's reversal, we begin to understand just how fundamental the arrow of time is to everything we consider reality. Every law of physics, every biological process, every aspect of consciousness and society depends on the assumption that cause precedes effect, that entropy increases, that the future emerges from the past rather than the reverse. The reversal of time would not simply be the undoing of history, but the complete transformation of existence itself into something utterly incomprehensible to minds that evolved to navigate forward through time. It would represent not just the end of the world as we know it, but the end of the very concept of knowing itself as information, memory, and causality dissolved back into the primordial uncertainty from which they originally emerged. In contemplating this impossible transformation, we gain a deeper appreciation for the remarkable consistency and directionality of the universe we inhabit, where time flows forward, entropy increases, and the future remains unwritten, waiting for us to create it through our choices and actions in each passing moment.